I will let our speakers introduce themselves so that they can tell you what their relationship with John was.
My name is Charlie Pierce. My mother was first cousin of John Hauberg. My mother and John Hauberg were first cousins. And Peggy and I saw a great deal of John Hauberg in connection with the Black Hawk Hiking Club.
I'm Ed Simpson. My grandmother was John's sister, Nora Hauberg-Lyford. I'm remembering him as a child. I was, I think, in 8th grade when he passed away. So I remember the horn honking and then in drives Uncle John. And he'd stop to visit us at home many times.
My name is Cynthia Burke. My grandmother was also Elnora Hauberg. My mother was Ada Mary Lyford Burke. Both of our mothers were sisters. So we had a close relationship with Uncle John, as we called him. I know he had kept a diary, a daily diary, really up until about the day he died. And so once when I was visiting the collections at Augustana, I thought, I'm going to look up the date that I was born to see if I was mentioned. I was mentioned. Because I was born on Christmas Day.
Delivered by my father.
Yes.
I'm Ann Hauberg Scott. John Hauberg and my dad were first cousins. Their dads were brothers. I think one of my favorite memories of John was February 20th, 1954. John walked me down the aisle when I married Jim, as my father had died earlier. I have a photo here to show you. Do you want to hold that up? John was 84 and I was 23. I'm not sure who is holding up who. Both of us are a little bit teary-eyed, but that is just a very special memory of John.
Okay. Who would like to start? Ann, you want to go on? Or?
So have you got my film clip ready
Yeah.
to roll?
Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk first and then show the film? She can have her 5 minutes, plus she has a 5-minute video. So, hold the microphone.
5 minutes will be the video.
Yeah, no.
If you know,
Closer.
that John was made an honorary Indian chief by the Meskwaki Indians. This took place Labor Day weekend, 1940, at the Indian powwow at Black Hawk State Park. He was given the name Chief Standing Bear. Abichi ni Masota Makwa. My dad took movies of this, and I have a 4.5-minute video that begins with Indian dances. These costumes are just beautiful. I was there. I was 10 years old at the time.
I'm surprised this is in color, Ann.
I was too when I got it out. I thought it would be black and white.
This is all from an 8mm film, and she took it down to various video services, and they converted it to a DVD.
In 1998, we had a Hauberg reunion, and so we took all the movies of Hauberg reunion and had them put on a VHS down at various videos. And I think, well, Steve's got all the film down in his basement, but I don't know how good it is anymore.
Play this again real quick, like, that was his dad.
Yeah.
That's John. This is Ann. And there's Ann. She's one on the left over there, too, in the group. Ed.
Very young Ed.
The little boy. And his father. And there, Ada Marie Lyford is your mother.
Before they were married.
Oh, is that your dad then, too?
There's Cynthia and
I'm on the
Janet.
right, my sister on the left. I don't want me to talk. I've jotted down a few things. We lived, the Bergs lived very close to, well, adjacent to Black Hawk State Park. And because then we were so close to the house on 23rd Street Hill, which is the address that was given for the Hauberg house, we were up there often. A couple things I remember about him. When we went to visit, we'd go back into the ice box and get pop, but we were not allowed to get root beer because that was Mr. Hauberg's favorite pop. And other things I remember growing up, he often would be in his office typing away. He always made copies of everything that he wrote, the yellow sheets of paper. So we still have a lot of those around. Or other times we'd find him in the library where he'd be reading. And then really in later years, closer to maybe the last year or two of his life, he would often be sitting in the living room with a book, by the radio, by the fireplace. A few other things I do remember. Oh, the other thing in later years, as far as dress, he always was dressed rather formally, but it didn't bother him if he had the frayed shirt collar or frayed cuffs, and his shoes were loosely tied in later years. We figured, well, his ankles and feet were swollen. And I also remember that must have been a Hauberg trait because his son, John Hauberg Jr., had that problem later in life. And now his granddaughter, Faye, has that same problem. When I was in third grade, we were studying Indians, and he did come and speak to my third grade class. There was a time when all the cousins would be getting together, the younger cousins, and playing. Edward probably remembers this, when he gathered all of us up in his green Packard, remember that, and we went driving up to the caves that were below Old Sugar Grove Farm, where he was raised. And we do remember all the parents watching as we young kids were all taken in his car up there. I think Mrs. Carlson, his cook, had packed us a lunch, but he was proud to show us that cave, and there were bats in that cave. He enjoyed being around family. Family was very important to him. I was just telling Ann, I remember in the 50s, he had quite the telescope in his sunroom. And so when we go up, we were watching the WHBF TV tower being erected every time. It was always focused on that. Then I did a little emailing before all of this. My brother, who was 8 years younger than me and very young, did write. He said that his memories go back to playing hide and seek in the mansion, which we all did, and he was still telling me this on the phone, the scary skeleton that was down in the basement. And he said we were never allowed in Uncle John's study, but my brother was the youngest kid in the bunch, and he said, Uncle John seemed to be very tolerant and kind to him, and there were times when my brother's little short legs didn't allow him to keep up with everybody, so Uncle John would allow him in the elevator with him, and they'd take the elevator up in the house. I also had a couple of emails from his granddaughter, Faye, who was out in Seattle, John Hauberg Jr.'s daughter, and she said she remembered trying to keep up with him walking around Camp Hauberg, so that's when we were at our Hauberg reunions. And he had such a big stride, she said, for a little girl. She said, we were there for some kind of boat race. It had to be a Hauberg reunion. And all the boats were decorated with paper flowers and balloons. And then she also remembers the Indian dances. We all remember those because we lived nearby. And I have a friend who lived in that area, grew up in the same area as I did. And he said, you know, at night if you'd go up to the park during the powwows, there would be an old man out sitting around with the Indians. And they'd all be talking, gathering. And I figured out that had to be John Hauberg, who would go back there in the evening. And then Faye also wrote, she said, oh, you have to mention his Kai call. We were in the hiking club, you knew that. And she said her dad always told a story. He said once when John Hauberg went to visit his son at Princeton, the son saw him far across I don't know, the quad or whatever it was, and gave that yell really loud. He said he did get his father's attention, but later his father said, I was so embarrassed when you said that. And then she said she also remembers how he showed her the bell underneath the rug. If you know the Hauberg house, there was a nice big dining room table. And when I was little, I remember climbing up onto the chairs. You had to virtually do that in order to sit there. But John Hauberg sat at one end. He could face, his back was to the window, but he could see the big, beautiful clock that was in the hallway, grandfather's clock. But Faye remarked, she said, yes, once Grandpa took me around to the other end of the table and pointed down under the rug the little button that Aunt Sue could hit and summon for somebody to come and either clear the table or serve food. And Faye said, well, that always explains now why you never hurt anybody. These people would just suddenly appear and deliver food. I don't know, when he died, I was just starting, it was my first week of going to Rock Island High School, where Peggy at one time or another was my PE teacher. I do have many other memories, but I'll stop with this.
Well, I've got notes of all different periods here, but he was a favorite person of mine. He seemed to relate to me as a youngster very well, and always had fun with him. He would come to the farm and look around and visit, and of course have lunch and so on. I remember in particular guessing about my 8th or 9th birthday, somewhere along there. He was at my birthday party, and my folks gave me a lariat. Well, the lariat was a piece of hemp rope about 15 feet long. Well, you know what that's like. It's kind of goes every which way. Well, Uncle John said, you know how to keep the loop open, don't you? Well, of course I didn't know. You know, you take it like this and swing it around while it's all together. Well, we had sheep out in the barnyard there, and it happened to be up from the pasture. Why, he said, let's go out and show you how this works. So we go out and shut the gate there to keep sheep, some of them in the lot there. And he said, you've got to roll your wrist, and you can keep that loop open. Why, here's an 80-year-old guy out there with a 8-year-old, and we're roping sheep. That's pretty good. That man, I would say, was a consummate community activist and archivist. He did it all, and he had such a wonderful personality that he was asked to help and work on so many different community things, and he'd start things also. But I've got a list here of some of the things, and these happened before my time, many of them, but it has to be mentioned. In 1921, he bought Archie Allen's property, which and then turned it into the YWCA. He and Aunt Sue, I'm sure, paid for the dorms and so on. Then he bought the Woodard site, fellow by the name of Dude Woodard owned the property there, which he and Aunt Sue turned into Camp Hauberg, the YMCA camp. And he was a firm believer in, you don't need a swimming pool, you swim in the river. And that was back before the river was cleaned up. And they had canoes, and they made sure that they did nature or natural things. Then, of course, you mentioned the powwows. That was quite a thing to start that, to get the Indians to actually come here. He was on the Illinois State Archaeological Society, president of the Illinois Historical Society, president of the Lutheran League, Illinois. On a saloon league, I'm not just sure. Which side of it?
There's an M I'm missing.
Yeah, on the other side of the saloon, I think. Sunday School Association of Illinois, YMCA Illinois, trustee, International Council of Religious Education, vice president of local YMCA, Public Library Board, 30 years Tri-City Symphony, 37 Augustana College, 37 local YMCA president since founding Black Hawk Hiking Club. He and Sue served on Bethany Home Board, headed the Rock Island County Forest Preserve, active part in creating Black Hawk State Park. His collection is the Black Hawk Museum. And of course, he was president here of this society, Rock Island County Historical Society, and kept it going during the Depression when things were really tough. But really a favorite of mine, and there's more stories, but I think my time's up.
Well, thank you, Ed. I decided to focus on some things that will not be found in the published information. There's a lot of published stuff about John Hauberg, but here are some comments regarding alcohol and tobacco that I don't think ever have gotten into any of the printed material. He and his wife, Sue, were both strong opponents of alcohol and tobacco. Of course, they were really very devout religious people, but they really didn't like any of these two things. And so as a result, some interesting things happened. I've talked with John Jr. and Kay, his daughter, and they never drank with their parents present. And Kay said she was very careful never to smoke, whether when her father or mother were around. John Jr. also made the comment, he said, Dad seemed to have had a great life. He just enjoyed and did everything. Said the one thing I'm sure he never experienced was a good martini. And then John Hauberg, I think, told me this one about the symphony. It was then the Tri-City Symphony. He was on the board. They asked to have a meeting at Hauberg's house. And he told them, fine, we'd be honored to have it, but there would be no smoking. And since quite a few of the members smoked, they decided to take their meeting elsewhere. And then there was a story about from 1928, of the Swedish Crown Prince who was visiting Augustana, and he was at a reception at Hauberg's house, and he was apparently with a group of men talking, and the story was he took a cigar out of his pocket and was getting ready to smoke it. And when he sensed the tension in the room and the expression on some of the faces, he put it back in his pocket. And then my favorite thing connected with alcohol, something Steve has used, I hope he used it, about John and Sue's wedding. This is the story from my mother, who was 19 years old at the time, and she was at the wedding dinner table. And Uncle Mark Hauberg, John Hauberg's father, who was very different from his son, and liked it and loved to talk nonstop, and had a good sense of humor, seated himself next to the preacher, who was also very strongly anti-alcohol. And Mother was sure this was deliberate on Mark Hauberg's part. He sat next to the preacher and then told him about taking a wagon load of produce into town to be sold at the farmer's market. And he said, our first stop would be in Cordova, and both the horses and I were dry, so they'd get water and I'd have a beer. And Mother remembered that the minister said, but something to the effect, well, Mr. Hauberg, wouldn't water have served just as well or even better? And he just waved that aside. He said, no, in a trip like that, a man needs beer. Well, then that wasn't the end of it, because she said, then when he got to Port Byron, the horses again were dry, and so was he. And when he got to Hampton, it was the same story. And she said, my mother said she she had to keep a straight face. She thought it was kind of funny. But John and Sue Hauberg didn't think it was funny at all. Then I have some things about the hiking club. Peggy and I think this may have been his favorite organization. That's a hard call to make, because he was, as you know, involved in so many things. But first, as a lead into this, I'd like to read a letter which showed his dedication to the hiking club. This was written when he was in the hospital, and it's dated September 7th. He died September 13th. And the letter is, Dear Charles, Vice President, I'm in the jug, or hospital. Anemia and prostrate. He got the spelling wrong. Kate pointed that out. Fiddling along. Better one day, less good the next. Friday next, they may cut out part of me and throw it out the window. I don't know. But whether or not, hiking cannot pause to see what's ahead. As you know, each director is obliged to turn in 3 leaders with respective hikes. These are then written up in some sort of order, sensible or otherwise, and sent to the printer. This last has always been my job, but I'm too uncertain now. So, will you officiate? All of us will be keen to see how the Pierce phraseology runs. I'm sure it will be refreshing. We've held to the same bulletin size so all can be bound if desired. We've tried to alternate Moline Awards, Rock Island Award, Davenport Award, and repeat. It does not always work out that way. I can continue to record attendance if it's sent in to me. Success to you and Peggy, from John H. Hauberg. So that's yes, yeah. Now he was a very strong leader. He had to be to be so successful in promoting all of the things he promoted. And with respect to the hiking club, the club still adheres to his basic premises, starting from 1920. No alcohol on hikes or hiking club events. No smoking by women. It was all right with men. They were already doing it way back when. A strong religious influence. For example, on Big Hike, we would always close the evening with circle, everyone getting in a big circle holding hands, reciting the Lord's Prayer, and then taps, and ending with, thanks for the day, comrades. he insisted we never cancel hikes, and really that worked very well. He also liked simple organizations, and the hiking club is a very simple, easy to run organization. With only one membership meeting a year and perhaps 2 hike planning meetings, and that takes care of meetings. It's none of this business of having a monthly meeting because it's a month since the last one. Now, his leadership on the 1949 2-week big hike of the hiking club, I think, really exemplified his leadership qualities. This was to Monument Valley in Utah, the Navajo Reservation, and the Grand Canyon. On this trip, there were 31 people, 2 ailing trucks, and terrible roads, which added up to a problem-laden trip, but it was a wonderful trip. This was 1949, and you may recall the quality of automobiles and trucks coming out of Detroit at that time was terrible. They could sell anything they could make, and we had a couple of them that didn't work very well. But to give you an idea, these were fairly new trucks, and we had, between the two, 7 garage-type problems, kind of required going into a garage, including putting new piston rings in one of the trucks, which means you have to tear the engine apart, and a new crankshaft in the other one. And you can imagine all the delays involved with that. And then the roads in Monument Valley were almost, at that time, almost non-existent. Today they are beautiful highways. And for example, they weren't paved at all, and there were almost no culverts, where you had where the water would wash through and from an infrequent rain. And several times we had to stop the truck and find rocks and find stuff to fill in the hole a bit so we could get the truck across, minus passengers. And through all of these problems, John Hauberg just brushed aside any suggestions that we change our route to go to some more well-traveled road. He would just brush this aside and say, "We'll get through. I'm sure it's going to work out." And he had such confidence and determination that there really wasn't very much backlash from unhappy campers. Now, and he did not micromanage. He set the agenda, kept his eyes on the big picture, and all the other people, as usual, just did their thing, and it worked out. The result, really, I think, was one of the best big hikes the hiking club ever had, in spite of all these difficulties. And one closing bit of information: when John Hauberg was probably about 83 years old, maybe 84, he invited us home from church with him to have lunch with him. And it was a miserable day, snowing and blowing, just an absolutely lousy day. We were sitting out in the sun porch after lunch, and I made the mistake of saying, "Well, now, Mr. Hauberg, with all this lousy weather, why aren't you in some nice, warm, sunny place like St. Petersburg?" He looked at me, he said, "What?" He said, "And sit around with all those old people waiting to die?"
Okay, you mentioned about John and the no smoking. Family Christmases were held in my parents' home in Moline. John, his children and grandchildren were always there, along with these 2 youngsters and their families. And John Jr. and his wife and Kay always went down to our basement because they just had to smoke and they couldn't smoke upstairs. Of course, my father was up there smoking like a steam engine, but nobody else could because John just was so against it. And I almost remember that John's housekeeper always provided an enormous ham for our dinner. She later told my mom how much she appreciated this family gathering, as she was able to spend Christmas Eve with her daughter and family because my parents entertained John and his children. I also remember many, many Hauberg reunions, and John did plan most of them. They were originally held at Camp Archie Allen every 5 years on Labor Day weekend. We kept the 5-year for a while. However, 1945 was not held because of the war, but there was a special 1948 reunion when people could travel again. Our last Hauberg reunion was held in 1998 to celebrate 150 years since the original Hauberg family left Schleswig-Holstein in Germany to come to America. Cynthia, Ed, and my son Steve, along with John's granddaughter Faye Hauberg Page, were the planning committee. We held this reunion at the Abbey Hotel, where we had indoor plumbing and hot and cold running water instead of Camp Archie Allen because the leadership had changed. We toured the old Hauberg homestead in Coe Township, courtesy of Ed, who knew how to find it. The roads, I had been there many times growing up, but my father was always driving. But when it was up to me to tell Jim how to find it, we needed help. We went to Black Hawk Park that weekend, where John's museum is located, and spent time at John and Sue's home doing a treasure hunt. You and your sister, was it just your sister that did that? And enjoying the house. They and her cousin, Susie Kayai, even uncovered a closet that held many copies of Marx Hauberg memoirs, which we could then share with the younger generation who didn't have the original copies. But that was 1998, and John's children had given that house to the city of Rock Island many years before. Why these books were never found in the closet until Susie and Faye, who had spent so much time there, they knew every nook and cranny. But you have a copy that was actually my Uncle Herman's, but I think you have one of they look brand new and untouched, which they were. But it was just a great treasure to find all of these books.
And your name?
Yeah. The hiking club, I was ordinarily introduced to everyone in the hiking club and out as Marion Miller's nephew, at which point people would say, aha, I know who you are, you're a little skinny kid. And I was. But I remember specifically when Ann was talking about the powwow, and this had to have been in 1948, an incident which I've referred to since many times as the Red Man's Revenge. And this is at the new installation there at Black Hawk State Park, as it was, with the permanent seats and the dance ground and the whole thing. And the dancers came on, and then several powwowshiks were mentioned in that video. And this was another one, I think, named Henry, who was an old man at that time, and was told that he was Black Hawk's great-grandson. At any rate, he got up before us and he said, so glad to meet you, da-da-da-da-da. And then he said, red brothers and sisters, white friends, and so on, let us pray. At that point, he had us, because everybody stood up, right? And then he commenced to pray, and he commenced to pray, and he prayed for either 20 minutes or a half hour in Sac and Fox. And exactly the only words that any non-Sac or Fox speaker, and that was everybody except the red men and women, the only words we could recognize were Jesus Christ and Harry S. Truman.
I was chairman of Trinity Lutheran's 100th anniversary celebration, and as a result, I did quite a bit of research, including John Hauberg. And what I found out was, let me share this with you. He belonged to Grace Lutheran Church, which you probably have never heard of, maybe. But Grace Lutheran, it still exists. It's down on 7th Avenue, a block from St. John's, a block west of St. John's. It's now called the Chosen Few or something like that. It's a very small church. It was an English-speaking Lutheran church, and in the 20s they merged with St. Zion Lutheran Church into what is now St. John's on 7th Avenue. Anyway, he was a member of Grace, which was the English-speaking church, and he was affiliated somehow loosely with a Sunday school, the 7th Street Sunday School it was called. It was located located in the school building that was on the site of what's his name, Wells?
William Carr.
William Carr, I'm sorry. Remember the William Carr School that was torn down about 79 or 80? Anyway, the 7th Street School, elementary school, was located on that corner at that time, and then the Sunday school met in the public school. Anyway, he was the chairman of, he became the chairman of the Sunday school because the man that was doing it became ill and he left town. I suppose he went and lived with his kids or closer to his kids and died a year later. So John Hauberg was superintendent of the Sunday school for about 6 or 7 years until 1911 when he got married. And then he didn't want to, this was in the afternoon, but he didn't want to stay away from his wife on Sunday afternoon, so he quit the Sunday school job. And at that point, I think what probably happened was the people that were involved, the parents that were involved in the Sunday school, decided, hey, this is all going to fall apart if he leaves. And so what did they do? They found a location up on the 3rd floor of the bank building, which is now that white building on the corner of downtown Moline across from Vladimir Sino's, down on the east end of that corner across the street. It's now apartments up there, but it was a 3-story bank building at that time. And Trinity Lutheran Church started on the 3rd floor of that church. He never belonged to Trinity. He stayed a member of Grace that whole time. But Trinity was formed as an English-speaking church also. So that's just a little side about the religious side of him. Yes, another comment?
So, how did the John Hauberg Boys start? How did the John Hauberg Boys group start that would take the Lincoln Highway and go out west and talk to the Indians? Because the boys had to play a musical instrument.
The fife and drum corps.
Well, it was a Sunday school group. Does anybody here know anything about that?
Hey, one time.
Oh, Farrell.
John, I think I read it, he thought that the city boys were becoming sissified, and they were no longer out in the country and the farm and leading a hardy life, so he formed this boys band, I think it was, and they would take hikes around. And there are several pictures that he took in the Black Hawk Park area, especially down where Saukenok was located. And he has the boys band with the musical instruments on the council house mound, right down off of 49th Street in Rock Island. That's one of the reasons he formed the group, just to get the boys out and lead a more hardy life.
Well, my sister's here, Darlene Holzhammer, and I'm Judy Belfer, and our dad, Joseph Holzhammer, was one of the boys that he took with him. But what my dad would talk about, everybody had to play a musical instrument. You had to have one change of underwear, and he would issue you goggles and a blanket. They had 2 trucks that were canvas covered, and they went out on the Lincoln Highway. And John would set up at these different Indian villages, and the boys would play songs, whatever, on their instruments, and the Indians, and he would talk with the Indians, and he would trade with them, and these trading treasures became the foundation for him starting the museum up at Black Hawk Park. So, but we've never found much information on these Sunday Boys bands, but they took the Lincoln Highway, which was not paved. So my dad would say, you know, at the end of the day, when they took their goggles off, that was the only white part of their skin.
Some of John Hauberg's antipathy toward tobacco. It was his father's habit, Marx Hauberg's habit, of chewing tobacco. And in his, I believe in his book Memoirs, I think he says something to the effect, I'm a pig chewing tobacco or something like that. But someone, he started chewing tobacco, I believe, because someone told him he had too much muscle for his bone, and this perhaps would cure the problem. It was some improbable thing like that. But I remember Max Hauberg visited my grandfather, his brother-in-law, and my grandfather was seated in his usual chair alongside the fireplace, and Max Hauberg was sitting sort of in the middle of the room, a fair distance from the fireplace, talking and chewing tobacco, and then intermittently spitting from his chair into the fireplace. And my grandmother, I remember her sort of in the colonnade between the dining room and living room, looking very nervous about what was likely to happen to her carpeting with all this tobacco juice. But I don't think he ever ruined anything. I wouldn't be surprised to find that this was part of why John Hauberg didn't like tobacco.